Hello, and welcome to our first developer skill sprint for the third quarter of this year, 2015. My name's Al Manarino, and I'm one of the Embarcadero software consultants. This skill sprint will cover using the new RAD Studio XE8 native HTTP client libraries. This new native HTTP client library for both VCL and FireMonkey is based on platform HTTP and HTTPS support, and no OpenSSL is required. Now, the purpose of these developer skill sprints are to give you a 20-minute session that focuses on a new skill that you can use immediately, and to get answers to your questions in a live questions and answers session at the end of the skill sprint. Now, this blog note link you see on the slide, this will give you the replay of this session, including links for sample projects used in this skill sprint. This skill sprint, using the new native HTTP client libraries, works with all the RAD Studio XE8 and App Method April 2015 release supported platforms using both Object Pascal and C++. So you can use the same new native HTTP client libraries on Windows, Mac OS X, Android, and iOS, both with VCL and FireMonkey. And the new native HTTP client libraries include native support for SSL, Gzip encoding, etc. What will be covered? For this skill sprint, we'll quickly explain the reasons for using the new native HTTP client libraries. We'll cover how to use the two new native HTTP client library components, the TNet HTTP client and the TNet HTTP request, to handle HTTP requests. We'll look at how to configure your application at design time. We'll show how to send a request and handle its response. We'll show how to handle and track the progress of the download of the response data. And lastly, we'll look at handling basic authentication and certificates. Before this XE8 release, in most technologies that needed to use HTTP, we were using INDY, Internet Direct, as our underlying support for features like our DataSnap servers or backend as a service components, REST clients, and cloud APIs. So everything that needed to use HTTP was somehow wrapping the INDY components. Now, the INDY library is fairly complete and offers support for many internet protocols, but with INDY, there was one specific issue we developers faced related to HTTPS support. To support the Secure Socket Layer, SSL, INDY leverages the OpenSSL library, which is already available and pre-installed on some of the target platforms. However, due to United States export restriction that limit the redistribution of this library, and we know that over the last year, a few bugs emerged in the OpenSSL implementation, Embarcadero felt it better and easier to rely on the platform support for HTTPS rather than deploying a custom solution. But now INDY is still in the IDE, but now in XE8 we have a new class for working with HTTP and HTTPS that wraps the underlying support for HTTP clients on different platforms. Now in XE8 we have the new native HTTP client libraries. This was added in XE8 to be more independent from the underlying HTTP support. So now in XE8 you can implement HTTP and HTTPS calls using the new Net HTTP client and Net HTTP request components, which map to the platform-specific HTTP client libraries and rely on the operating system SSL layer rather than an external one. So this removes a developer hurdle, so you no longer need to find and embed the proper SSL library, and also importantly, This removes our developer responsibility in having to ship a version of the SSL library that is clear of any known issues. And another benefit is this also reduces the application footprint, given that you don't need to add an additional library to your application. So that's all very cool. Now the last thing I'm going to mention on this slide is that in XE8, the runtime library has a new unit, system.hash, and this unit includes classes and methods that allows you to use 3 hash functions in your applications, and those are Bob Jenkins, MD5, and SHA1. Let's now look at configuring your application at design time for using an HTTP client. Now the runtime library provides these 2 components that you can use to send HTTP requests to servers and handle their responses. It's the TNet HTTP client and the TNet HTTP request. Now to create an HTTP client that you can use to send HTTP requests, you drop a TNet HTTP client from the tool palette onto your VCL form or a FireMonkey multi-device form or on a data module of your application. This TNet HTTP client does not require any initial configuration. Next, to create and configure the HTTP requests, you also need to drop 1 or more TNet HTTP request components onto your form or your data module. So after you drop the new HTTP request component, you'll double click on its client property on the object inspector so that its value is the HTTP client component that you previously dropped. Now you can use any number of request components that you like. However, if you need to send several different HTTP requests, a better approach might be to use a single HTTP request component and reconfigure that component at runtime to send each request. Now, let's go into the RAD Studio XE8 IDE and see how we can send a request and handle its response. So here I'm using RAD Studio XE8 Subscription Update 1. I'm going to start with a new Delphi project, a multi-device application, and a blank application. On the form, I'm going to drop a net HTTP client component, and I'm also going to drop a net HTTP request component. For the request component, I'm going to double click on its client property in the object inspector so that its value is the HTTP client component that we previously dropped. Now, to send an HTTP request, you must specify at least 2 properties for this net HTTP request component. We need to specify the HTTP request method using this method string property and a resource URL using this URL property. Now the HTTP request method, it determines the action that you want the server to perform on the resource located at the specified URL, such as sending you the data of the resource or updating the resource with data that you include in your request. Now how you send an HTTP request using this net HTTP request component depends on the HTTP request method that you want to use. Now it's important to note that functions that send a request, either execute or method specific functions, all are blocking. So that is, these functions do not return until there is a response from the server. But we're going to see later in this skill sprint that we can track the progress of the download of the response data to check on the status of the request. For this example, I'm going to configure the net HTTP client for allow cookies to be true, handle redirects to be true, and the user agent is Embarcadero URI client. For the net HTTP request, for the method string, I'm going to use get, and for the URL, I'm going to send it to Embarcadero.com. And the client is set to our net HTTP client. Now the HTTP request methods, for the method string property, it can be delete, get, head, options, or trace. And if you use one of these, then you do not require any input data other than the target resource URL. Now, if the request method for the method string is merge, patch, or put HTTP request methods, then in addition to the target resource URL, you require additional input data as described in the doc wiki. You'll need to call its matching function as shown in the doc wiki. In your call, you'll specify the URL of the target resource as your first argument and an instance of tstream as your second argument. And the post HTTP request method also requires input data as described in the doc wiki. So now, with these two HTTP components configured with a specific URL, we can now execute the HTTP request, reading the response stream and converting the response stream to a string, and then we can display the HTML source code in a memo component. So to this application, I'm going to add a button and a memo to display the HTML source code. Let me drop a button onto the form, and I'll also drop a memo onto the form. So the memo and the button. For the button, let me change its text property to be display the HTML source code. For our button click event, we want to use our net HTTP request, and we want to call its execute to send the request, and we want to call content as string because it contains the body of the response as a string. And we're going to want to display the HTML source code in the memo. So I'll add memo1 dot lines dot text, and that'll do that for us. So now I can run this app as a Windows 32-bit app. When we click on our display the HTML source code button, we see our HTML source code from our Embarcadero.com URL get displayed in our memo. So that's very cool. I'll show you the same app running as a C++ Builder, a VCL application, and it'll run the same. So I have my C++ VCL version of the same app here. So here's the same app. This time for C++, we do the same thing. We call its net HTTP request, call its execute, and then we call its content as a string. So if we run this as a C++ Builder VCL application, click on its display HTML source code button, we see the same HTML source code from our Embarcadero.com URL displayed in the memo, so that also works great. Let me again open up the FireMonkey multi-device application, and just to show you, so here's the FireMonkey multi-device application. So it's important to notice here that this same code works independently of the target platform, and it's also independent on the visual controls framework, as even existing VCL Windows applications can use this new HTTP client library. So this same code will work as a Windows 32-bit app, Windows 64-bit, an Android app, iOS app, or Mac OS X application. So that's all very cool. So very quickly, let me just send this application to my iOS iPad and show it running on an iOS iPad. So here's the app running on my iOS iPad. So when I click on its display HTML source code button, executes the request and displays the HTML source code in the memo box on my iPad. So that's all really cool. And very quickly, let me run the same app as a Mac OS X app. So building it for Mac OS X, deploys it to Mac OS X, click on the display HTML source code button, executes the request and shows me the HTML source code in my memo box as a Mac OS X app. So once again, all very cool. Next, let's look at how to handle and track the progress of the download response data. Now I mentioned before that functions that send a request either execute or method-specific functions all are blocking. So that means that these functions do not return until there is a response from the server. But we can track the progress of the download of the response data to check on the status of the request. So how do we handle and track the progress of the download response data? Well, for the handling of the download of the response data, as your HTTP client downloads the response to your request, the onReceiveData event of your HTTP request object keeps occurring. So you provide an event handler for onReceiveData to keep track of the progress of the download of the response data. Your event handler receives the following parameters. It has sender, which is your HTTP request object. It has an A content length, which is the expected length of the response data in number of bytes. And you have an A read count, which is the number of bytes of the response data that the HTTP client has downloaded so far. And you also have abort, which is a Boolean parameter that allows you to cancel the download. Now, when the download finishes, the onReceiveData event occurs for the last time, and the values of A content length and A read count are the same. And then the onRequestCompleted event occurs soon afterwards. And for tracking the progress of the download of the response data, you use the values of A content length and A read count in the onReceiveData event handler. And this slide shows sample Object Pascal and C++ code that calculates the percentage of the downloaded data using the values of A content length and A read count. So now let's look at some sample applications that show how to handle and track the progress of downloaded response data. This is a HTTP download app that ships with both Delphi and C++ Builder. It shows using the new HTTP client library components. So when you drop the HTTP client and HTTP request components onto the form, you get these three uses. You get system.net URL client, HTTP client, and HTTP client components. This app downloads using several different threads, so it's a multi-threaded app, and it's using the new HTTP client component to download files. And to save the file on the device, we're using tpath.combine with tpath.getDocumentsPath to be able to save the file on device. And to visually see the file being downloaded by multi-threads, we're using a tPanel with individual progress bars for the threads. Let's now run the app and see how it works. So I'll run it as a Windows 32-bit application. So here's the app. So with this app, I'm going to download the Box2D Manual P PDF file from the box2d.org website. So if you're not familiar, another new feature of XE8 is the translation of the open source Box2D physics engine. So with this app, I'm going to download the Box2D manual, which is an excellent manual on the concepts of Box2D and the physics engine. So I'm going to go ahead and click the Start Download button, and the Box2D manual.pdf got downloaded. So let's take a look in our file directory and see the file that just got downloaded. On my Windows box, this file gets downloaded to my documents, and there's the Box2D manual PDF that we just downloaded, and there it is. So that all works great. Let me show you one more example of an advanced HTTP download manager, also using the new native HTTP client library. So let me run this app. And again, we're going to go to the URL box2d.org. This time when I click on Get Links, it will give me the individual links from this URL. And from here, I can once again download our Box2D manual PDF file. When I click on download, we get this nice visual representation of the file being downloaded and completed. So once again, that works great. And again, it's using the new native HTTP client libraries available in XE8. So once again, that works great. Lastly, for this skill sprint, let's look at handling basic authentication and certificates. Now, HTTP Basic Auth, or Basic Access Authentication, is a widely used protocol for simple username password authentication. For example, when your web browsers prompts you for credentials like we see on this slide. So when you send an HTTP request to a server that requires HTTP Basic Access Authentication, the on-auth event of the TNet HTTP client component fires. And like we see in the code here for Object Pascal and C++, to submit your access credentials, you provide an event handler for this event, and if the value of the second parameter that the event handler receives and auth target is the tauth target type.server, then you fill in the A username and the A password variables with your username and password for HTTP access. And for certificates, the HTTP client component supports secure HTTPS connections. The HTTP framework automatically handles any certificate request that occurs and fires the appropriate event if necessary. So on the TNet HTTP client component, you have the onNeed client certificate event, and this fires when a server requests a certificate from the client. And you also have the onValidate server certificate event, and this fires if the server provides an invalid certificate. Now in the doc wiki, you'll find more information about handling certificates. So specifically, you look at the handling server-side certificates and the handling client-side certificate sections in the doc wiki for more information. So now let's look at an example that uses a basic authentication. So here I have a multi-device example app where my server requires HTTP Basic Access Authentication. On the on-auth event of my HTTP client, here is where I submit my access credentials. But for this app, I'm going to get my username and password from my login screen. I'll run the app. Now, if I give invalid username and password and click my button, I get the HTTP status message of unauthorized, and that's correct. It's working correctly. But if I give it valid username and password and click my button, then I'm granted HTTP access. So again, everything is working great. This ends what I wanted to cover on this skill sprint on using the new RAD Studio XE8 native HTTP client libraries. So here are links for additional learning resources on how to use the new native HTTP client library, including links to the DocWiki pages and links to the sample code projects I used in this skill sprint. And again, you can go to the blog notes link on the bottom left corner of the slide to get the replay link for this session, and it should also give you links to the sample code projects. Next week's skill sprint on Tuesday, the 21st of July, will cover using Azure Translator Services for automatic text translation. So that sounds very interesting, and I'm going to be attending that session myself. And you can see the full schedule of replays at embt.co/sprints15. Here are the current RAD Studio Delphi and C++ Builder offers. You get these 3 free bonuses with the purchase of RAD Studio XE8, Delphi XE8, and C++ Builder XE8, the VCL and FireMonkey Premium styles, the new Object Pascal Handbook by Marco Cantu, and the Meta Converter Basic to help you convert your VCL components to FireMonkey components. And you have this special upgrade offer for owners of XE3 and earlier. With the purchase of an update subscription, you can save up to 45% off the regular price of XE8. So for more information, visit embarcadero.com/rad offer. This ends this developer skill sprint on using the new native HTTP client libraries. You got to see how to use the new native HTTP client libraries. So thank you all for attending. So now let's open up this session for live questions and answers.
Okay, Al, thanks for that great presentation.
Thank you.
What about using the new components with DataSnap? Is that possible in XE8, or is that something that's going to be available later, or how would that be dealt with?
Let me just for data. I believe, let's see if I remember, did we not include them with the new? Did we not include these with DataSnap with the update subscription, or is that planned for the next release?
Oh, I don't know about the update subscription having that or not. That's a good question.
So was a specific question? He's just using DataSnap and using the open source SSL and just can't find the open SSL library, just meaning they're just not in the right location for DataSnap to find them or the iOS simulator to find them. Was that the intent of that question?
Yeah. So you're saying he was having trouble with the iOS simulator and the OpenSSL and wanting to know how to take advantage of the new native HTTPs instead. So we wouldn't need to use the OpenSSL. So I guess that's 2 ways to resolve that: how to use native HTTP or how to use OpenSSL with the iOS simulator.
Correct. So yeah, I'm trying to remember if we included these new native client libraries for DataSnap, or if it did not make it to this release, it was planned for next release. And for the OpenSSL libraries, so the .a files, it's probably simply the location of where he's putting them, either in the simulator or on a real iOS device for it to find them. And I'm trying to remember exactly where you need to drop these .a files for iOS to find them. And I know we have that documented, so if I don't find it during this Q&A, I'll post where you go looking for these.
Okay, he's saying
where
you put them in the user lib folder.
That's correct.
All right. So the question about OAuth, for that there was a webinar on OAuth that you can take a look at. I posted the skill sprint link for that on OAuth. Alf is asking, he says, I bought Indy, or it says in Indy I can give the browser another name, which can use for browser access. Is it still possible using these components?
That's a good question. I have not tried that myself.
It does have
Let me try.
Property that you can use.
Yeah, I have not tried that myself, but let me try that myself, and when I get it working, I'll post my solution on how I did it, if it's possible.
Yeah, the user agent, I mean, that's what the purpose of the user agent is on the net HTTP client component. Yeah, the client component, I think is
That's
used.
correct.
Yeah, so that should do accomplish that task. That's what we looked at for that. Is there a component wrapper for Internet Explorer like earlier versions of Delphi? There's Internet Explorer. The T web browser component is available in XE8, just like before.
Correct, that's correct.
How about, is it possible to set the timeout on the request for the HTTP client?
I don't think there's a timeout because all of these requests are blocking. So, but then you can check. You can check the status of the downloads or the request, and if you don't see anything happening, if something went wrong, and then there is an abort call you can use to terminate.
Okay. How to do SSL pinning? Since the docwiki states the onValidate server certificate event occurs when the server certificate is invalid. I believe, isn't there another event that fires for when a certificate is requested before the other one fires saying it's invalid? And so at that point you could provide a different server certificate?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah. I can't remember what that event's called.
Yeah, again, for the doc wiki, you got handling server-side certificates and handling client-side certificates. So there are events for like on need client certificate and on validate server certificate that you can use for that.
Okay, need client certificate. One more question. Are web services imported via WSDL built on top of these new components? If I remember correctly, let's use the HTTP Rio component. Is that using the new native client library?
I'm not sure. So are web services imported via WSDL built on based on these new components?
I think they're still using the.
Yes, I don't think.
Yeah, I don't think they're using the new ones yet.
Correct.
You may be able to do it manually. Okay, so he's saying that the onValidate server certificate event only fires if the server certificate is invalid. But you need for SSL pinning, you need to check for a specific certificate or certificate authority. Get the event when the certificate is valid.
Yeah, so from what I've seen from these components, if the server requires a client certificate, then the on need certificate event fires, and that's where you can check your list of client certificates and determine which certificate you want to send to the server. But let me test and try that myself, and I'll send you the results on what I find.
Are you going to post those on your blog or?
Yeah. That blog notes URL link. I'll put whatever Q&As we have not explicitly answered. I'll list them on my blog notes link that was on the slides.
Okay, great. Are the OAuth services still using Indy? So OAuth would be using the REST components, which are using the new HTTP client library, I believe, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, so you're going to test on, okay, great for that. Okay, it looks like we've gotten through all of the questions. Thanks again, Al. This was a great, very informative skill sprint session.
Thank you. Yeah, it was my pleasure. So yeah, and thanks for these additional questions. So it's let me come up with sample solutions for these great questions you have for functionalities using these new native HTTP client libraries, and I'll post them to my blog link, and then everybody will benefit from them. So thanks again for these great questions.
Great, yeah. Yeah, I really like the new HTTP client components. They're great because they do have that built-in support for the encryption as well as the compression. For example, for connecting to a web server that's spitting out Gzipped compressed content.
That's correct.
That as well. So great stuff.
That's correct. In that basic that basic authentication example I put up there. I'm using the Zlib for that too.
Yep.
So that worked out quite nice. And it still stays the same. Even if we look at the basic authentication, you still have to do the normal encode 64. So you still have to pass that authentication header, and you still have to create the tnet.header, the .create, the authorization, the basic, and then you have to do the encode 64 and pass it in your username and password. So all of that still remains the same.
Yeah. Yep. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Al. And I'll be talking with you again here at the afternoon session. And but then next week we have as you mentioned, the automatic translation with the Azure Web Services. So lots of great stuff. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you. Thank you all for attending.
Yep. Bye.
So the question is, on-valid server certificate is only invoked when the certificate is invalid. The doc wiki states that it's fired when checking the validity of a server certificate. Well, from the doc wiki, it tells me if the server provides an SSL certificate, but this certificate is invalid, the on-validate server certificate event fires. So you provide an event handler for this on-validate server certificate so that you can check the server certificate from certificate and determine whether or not you accept the server certificate. So if you accept the server certificate, then you change the value of the accept parameter to be true. So hopefully that answers the question there. How to handle different encoding on the server. So there is a parameter, if I have it here in front of me. So there is a parameter that allows you to provide the encoding. So it's either on the client or the request. There is one of the properties where you can specify the encoding you want to use on the server. So that's that. For server-side SSL development, is OpenSSL still a requirement?
But the new client libraries are only for the client side, right? If you're doing server development, if you're doing HTTP server development, you still need OpenSSL then, correct?
Well, that's correct. Yeah, I misread that. That is correct. So yes, on the server side, yes, OpenSSL is still a requirement. Where can we get examples on C++ Builder? All the examples I use here, I have both Object Pascal and C++ Builder examples. So from this blog link on the bottom here, embt.co/sprint-native-http, I'll post examples of all the projects I use in both C++ and Object Pascal. XLNT.
Excellent.
Excellent. Oh, thank you. I thought there was a new acronym out there that I didn't know.
Yeah, it took me a second too because I was like, Excel, that's excellent.
I kept thinking that was great. Let's see. Another question. I was a little confused on extracting the links from something like Box2D, where you were able to see all of the available links from that site. Are you stating that I can put in any type of URL and extract all available links offered by the website? So yes, when you look at that sample app, both C++ and Object Pascal version, and when you look at the code, you'll see how it works. If you have a website that is available links, it will parse those links and display them for you to select.
And that's code in the sample application. That's not a component that we provide that does that.
That is correct. Yeah, that was done through code. Since we have components for REST client stuff, do you guys also plan making stuff for being a RESTful server? All right, so yes, we do have REST client stuff, and you can continue to use the REST client stuff. Like for example, so for these native HTTP client libraries, I showed you using basic authentication. There's always there's like OAuth, OAuth1, and OAuth2, and those still come from the REST client libraries. So if I understand your question here, so since we have components for REST client stuff, do you guys also plan making stuff for being a RESTful server? So Jim, anything you know about in the roadmaps that thinks we might be able to do this?
So in XE7, we released the Enterprise Mobility Server, which is a RESTful server, which is a really great, easy-to-use RESTful server. It's does all the hard work like user authentication and stuff like that for you automatically. All you have to do is add how you want to deal with the endpoints, and it's really straightforward. I believe there were some skill sprints on EMS, Enterprise Mobility Server, you can check out. It says mobility in the name, but it's not for mobile only. It just everything's mobile anymore, so it works with mobility, but also works with desktop clients. You can also use DataSnap to create a RESTful DataSnap server, but that's a little bit different in that it does maintain state, and it's really only for connecting DataSnap clients RESTfully. You could connect other RESTful clients, but the best solution we have right now for creating a RESTful server is EMS, Enterprise Mobility Server. That's going to be the best. And actually, people have done RESTful servers with just using Indy and parsing it all yourself, but EMS is the way to go. Much easier to do.
Very good, correct. Another question, when will the new HTTP client be used in a DataSnap REST client? I think it currently still requires OpenSSL. So that's correct. So these new native HTTP client libraries, they work for most of the technologies in XE8 except for DataSnap right now. But if you look at the roadmap, the plan is for the next release, I believe, to include these new native HTTP client libraries for DataSnap also. So for now, for DataSnap, yes, you still need the OpenSSL, and you'll drop those SSL libraries in the appropriate library folders so for it to find it, whether it's Windows or iOS.
Technically, because you do have the full source code, I believe you probably could change it yourself to use the new net HTTP client if it's really urgent for you. But
that's correct.
Use the OpenSSL for now, and in the future release it'll work.
That's correct. You folks on attending this are on the beta program for the next release, but if you were, there's probably a good chance you might see these new native HTTP client libraries used with DataSnap.
Well, and everybody that's on update subscription will get access to the beta as well. So if you do want to find out what's coming in the future, make sure you're on update subscription, and you'll be invited to the beta to check that out. All right. Well, thank you, Al, for that great session, and also for answering all those questions.
Thank you. It was my pleasure. And thank you to Embarcadero for giving us these new native HTTP client libraries, so I no longer have to go find the OpenSSL libraries to embed into my application. So thank you, Embarcadero.
Oh, yeah. They're great. I was actually doing creating a client to go out and connect to a server, and it was using the Zip compression, Gzip compression, and SSL, and I'm like, put down the adapters, deploy the library. And I'm like, wait, there's that new net client. And I was like, I don't want to figure out how to work this. And well, what the heck, I'll try it. Oh my goodness, so simple, and it just worked. Decompressed and decrypted everything. I was excited. It was just so simple and worked so well for me. And as you showed, it's easy to work with, and it has all the features you need as well. So great stuff.
All right, thank you again all for attending, and have a great day.
All right, thanks. Oh, and so everybody tune in next week for the Azure services for decryption or automatic text translation. And if you came in late today and want to catch part of the first part again, you can join us for the session later today. What's at 5 p.m. Pacific time, I think. So join us for that. Thanks.
I see a couple of questions in here. Let me go after these questions right now. First. Vladimir asks, are these native HTTP client library components available in the professional edition of either Delphi or C++ Builder? And the answer is yes. So everything you saw here, the TNet HTTP client and the TNet HTTP request are also in professional edition. Another question here. So if you recall, I said that some of these functions, these execute functions, are blocking requests. So someone asks, like in Indy, do I still need to use the antifreeze component to continue updating the display like we have in Indy? So if you recall in the presentation, to track the progress of the download of the response data, you use the values of the A content length and the A read count, and you use that on the on received data event handler, and that kind of gives you an indication if the response is coming back, and if it's not coming back, then we give you the abort command to terminate the execution.
And
Hopefully
while
that
you were
answers.
doing that, it wasn't locking up the UI at all, so it doesn't freeze the UI, so you don't need to use antifreeze.
That is correct. Okay.
Is the new client library based on WinINet or WinHTTP?
Because when if I a good question. I had to look inside the source code, and if I look inside the source code, if you're using MS Windows, it does say we're using the WinHTTP. So hopefully that answers that question.
Can the new HTTP components be used in applications running as Windows services?
I don't see why not. Think about this. I have not tried that myself, so I'm going to take that as a homework assignment, and I'm going to do it myself, and I'll post the solution. So at the, if you see at the bottom left of this blog notes, this embt.co/sprint-native.http, the replay will get posted there. The sample code links will get pasted there, and answers to these questions you have, like this one specifically, I'll try it out myself, and I'll post the response there. Unless you know already, Jim, have you tried running these components as a Windows service?
I have not tried it, but I would suspect it should. I don't see any reason why not, based on my understanding of how those work and based on the way Windows services work. But yeah, go ahead and try it out and let us know.
Okay. So thanks for that question, John.
Any plans to have these available for DataSnap?
Okay, so I'll tell you now as I speak. Currently, for XE8, we did not have them for support for DataSnap, but you do have the source code for them. So in theory, you could get them to work if you follow our roadmap plans for the next release. The plans are for DataSnap to fully be supported with these new native HTTP components. So for me, I want to personally thank Embarcadero for giving me these great new native HTTP client libraries. So it saves me the trouble of having to go find a valid working OpenSSL to embed either in my Windows apps or my iOS apps. So that saves me a lot of effort and trouble needing to do this.
Yeah, they're a great productivity boost because, as I said earlier, I was doing a project where I needed to connect to a web service that was encrypted and compressed, and I dropped down the Indy HTTP components and I started putting down all the stuff to do OpenSSL and to do the decompression, all that stuff, and I was like, this is such a pain. And I was like, wait a second, there's this new native components, and I tried them out, and they worked. They were easy to use, as you showed, and it just did the decompression, did the decryption automatically, and was so much better. So they're great. I love them too.
Yeah, they work quite nice with some of these existing components, like that basic user auth application I showed in there. I'm using the compressor zlib to compress and decompress the resources going back and forth. So out of the box, they work quite nice.
So here's a new question that came in here. Does the REST debugger tool, which ships with XE8, use the new HTTP client components?
So that REST debugger tool is all based on our REST client libraries. Let's see. So so you know what? So if you can give me more details on what issues you're having trying to connect to Azure SQL database, that could probably help. Or if you post it to our community.embarcadero.com with some additional details I'm sure either myself or someone else be happy to dig into it and see what it's doing or not doing.
Yeah, it should be using it because that is using the REST client components, and the REST client components use the new HTTP native components, so it should be using it. I've not verified that it is, but it definitely should be using it because it is using that tool stack.
Okay. Here's another question. Next question. Okay, so just a little bit more detail. All right, so thanks for that additional detail. So the details, it gets certificate errors, which when I use C#, it works fine, and Chrome, etc., all works fine, but not the REST debugger tool. All right, so thanks for that additional information. I'll look into that.
So Bruce is asking if there's any examples of using SSL or if it's just transparent now.
So it is transparent, but I've been asked this question before. So once again, I'll take the action item to include an example with the sample apps on an example of using SSL and the SSL certificates.
Okay, great.
All right, so thank you all for attending, and enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you. Talk to everybody later. Hope to see you all next week for the Azure Services and Automatic Text Translation.
Great.